Firstly, thank you to BIVA for giving me the opportunity to present this work. We have no competing interests to declare. Originally, both squamous and glandular gastric disease was graded using this 0 to 4 scale, described back in 1999, which most of us will be very familiar with by now. This system was shown to have better inter-observer agreement than the number severity scoring system shown here. Agreement in this study was assessed by 3 diplomats using a combination of both squamous and glandular lesions and was shown to be high. Equine glandular gastric disease is now considered as a separate entity to squamous disease. However, our understanding of its pathophysiology is somewhat incomplete. This makes classification of lesions difficult and means that grading systems for squamous disease may not be accurate for glandular disease. The current recommendation is to use descriptive terminology, which classifies lesions based on severity, distribution, shape, and appearance. Use of this descriptive system generates a large number of variables which may be challenging to analyze in a research setting. In an attempt to simplify scoring, Sykes et al. Used a novel verbal rating scale in this paper, which is shown here, grading lesions from 0 to 2. At present, there is no validated scoring system for equine glandular gastric disease, and recent published work has actually reverted to using the original 0 to 4 scale to group data and facilitate statistical analysis. The main objectives of this study were to determine inter-observer reliability of both descriptive terminology and a verbal rating scale for glandular disease, and to assess if agreement improved with gastroscopy experience, specialist training, or familiarity with the descriptive system. To ascertain which factors were associated with a lesion being considered clinically significant, a secondary objective was to determine which other descriptive variables were associated with lesions being described as severe and which factors influenced respondents' decision to treat a lesion. We circulated an electronic questionnaire to both specialists and primary care veterinarians using ACVIM, ECIM, and Equine Veterinary Group listservs. The questionnaire contained 20 images of glandular lesions, and respondents were asked to grade each image using the current descriptive terminology and the verbal rating scale used by Sykes et al. Respondents were also asked whether they would recommend treatment based solely on that image. To determine inter-observer agreement, Krippendorff's alpha coefficient was used. This is very similar to Fleiss's kappa, with the added benefit of being able to account for missing data. Generalized linear mixed effects models, with image and observer included as random effects, were used to determine which other descriptive parameters contributed to lesions being described as severe and respondents' decision to treat. A chi-squared test was used to determine if there was an association between description of severity and the verbal rating scale. 82 veterinarians responded. 49 were diplomats of equine internal medicine and 33 were non-specialist veterinarians. Of the internal medicine diplomats, 28 used the descriptive system, 16 used the original 0 to 4 system, 4 used both, and 1 used the descriptive system in combination with the verbal rating scale. Among non-specialists, 16 used the descriptive system, 13 used the 0 to 4 system, and 3 used both. There was no difference between the groups for the scoring system used. This table here shows inter-observer agreement overall and for subcategories of the descriptive system. The same cutoffs as kappa can be used here, with an alpha value of greater than 0.8 considered to reflect strong agreement. So as you can see, when all 4 descriptive variables were combined in this top row, there was no to minimal agreement. The best agreement, although this was still moderate, was in the severity category. And agreement here was comparable among diplomats and respondents who used the descriptive system in practice, regardless of their specialist status. The verbal rating scale was comparable among all categories of respondent. And when all responses were combined, the verbal rating scale and severity category actually showed similar agreement. The verbal rating scale performed better than the severity category among non-specialists, while the severity category performed better among all other groups of respondent. Appearance and shape, but not distribution, were associated with lesions being described as severe. Depressed lesions were 4 times more likely to be described as severe compared with flat lesions, and hemorrhagic or fibrinosuppurative lesions were both 3 times more likely to be described as severe than erythematous lesions. Experience level and scoring system currently used were not kept in the final multivariable model. We then looked at how the verbal rating scale score and severity category were related. We found that description of severity was associated with a verbal rating scale score, and a lesion with a score of 2 was 75 times more likely to be described as severe than a lesion with a score of 1. The same factors associated with a lesion being considered severe were associated with the decision to treat. This is unsurprising, as a severe lesion would typically infer clinical significance. We found that diplomats were less likely to treat lesions than non-diplomats, although this should be interpreted with caution, as in practice, the decision to treat is influenced by many factors. Overall agreement in the study was poor, particularly when all 4 descriptive variables were combined. This was a much larger study than that used to validate the original scoring system, and the large number of observers here increases the likelihood of disagreement. Poor inter-observer agreement for endoscopy in people has been previously described, with less experienced operators performing worse. In our study, diplomats had better agreement across all categories, but experienced gastroscopists did not perform as well. Among those already using the descriptive system, regardless of specialist status, agreement across all descriptive categories was comparable to the diplomat group, and this suggests that additional training may improve agreement. Agreement was worst for shape and appearance, which may reflect an unfamiliarity with the terms in use and the range of lesions seen in the glandular mucosa. It may be that better definition of the boundaries for each category may be necessary to improve agreement. Surprisingly, severity, which is the most subjective parameter, had the best agreement in our study. Loss of mucosal integrity, which is what the verbal rating scale is based around, was associated with severity. Depressed lesions were more likely to be described as severe, and this possibly reflects the appearance of a traditional ulcer or erosion. Distribution was not associated with lesions being described as severe, which is somewhat at odds with the original 0 to 4 scoring system that was based around lesion distribution. The association that we found between the severity category of the descriptive system and the verbal rating scale suggests that it may be possible to extrapolate to the verbal rating scale or something similar using the severity category. So grouping in research studies could be done using severity as the primary variable, something like 0 to 3, to incorporate mild, moderate, and severe lesions and make analysis easier. Our study had several limitations. Still images were used here, and these may be less representative of scoring in clinical practice. Video clips may have allowed better visualization of lesions. The 0 to 4 original scoring system was not included in this study, as the current recommendation is that it should not be applied to glandular disease. The biggest limitation of this work is that we asked respondents if they would treat a lesion based solely on that image, without providing any background information. This is somewhat artificial, as the decision is based on many factors in practice. To conclude, our study demonstrated that there was no inter-observer agreement for the descriptive system when all 4 variables were combined. The severity category showed the best agreement, and this was similar to the verbal rating scale. Severity was significantly associated with the verbal rating scale, suggesting it may be possible to extrapolate to the latter. The lack of agreement for appearance, shape, and distribution identified in the study questions the need for better definition of these particular parameters. As more is understood about clinical signs pertaining to glandular disease and the response of specific lesion types to treatment, a more comprehensive scoring system may be developed. In the meantime, additional training to increase familiarity with the descriptive system may improve agreement. The full article is now available as open access in the Equine Veterinary Journal, so do take a look if you would like to know more. Thank you for taking the time to watch this abstract, and I will be happy to answer any questions you may have.